Hello, I'm Grindle. Welcome back to Bots Drones episode 9 for the final Bots Drones challenge in Nutty Acres, known as Old Dog New Tricks. This challenge is essentially a boss battle, much like the one found in Banjo-Kazooie's Witchy World, in which you have to take down Mr. Patch by popping his patches. However, since this is not Banjo-Tooie, we are of course using a vehicle, and because this is Bots Drones, it has to be remote controlled. Unfortunately, quite similar to the challenge Leaky Waterworks, no matter how hard I tried to do this challenge, and no matter how much I experimented with it, I just could not get it done. I don't think it's impossible to do, in fact, quite the contrary. I think someone who is more skilled than me, and has more time to put into the attempts could certainly do it, but I personally failed laughably. And so, much like the other failed challenge in this Bots Drones series, Leaky Waterworks, I'm going to show the different attempts I made and the variations of vehicles I used while explaining exactly why it's so difficult to take down Mr. Patch as a Bots Drones vehicle. To begin with, as you've probably noticed from what you're seeing at the moment, it is extremely difficult to aim a remote control bot. I've mentioned on multiple occasions that it's difficult to control a bot or drone because of the lack of depth perception and the lack of automatic tracking, which it does remain true and continues to be an issue in this challenge, but it's not actually the biggest difficulty here. You see, when you're aiming a vehicle in Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, it's usually extremely easy because there's pretty much no curvature to the projectiles and they go exactly where you point them. The problem here in Bots and Drones is while that remains true, it's very difficult to tell exactly where you're pointing them. Doing what feels like really small micro-corrections entirely shifts your aiming radius, and to begin with, you're basically judging your entire accuracy on the previous shot fired, which isn't entirely helpful because both you and Mr. Patch is moving. It essentially feels like you're trying to thread a needle by using a puppet while on a spinning teacup ride. I, on the very rare occasion, managed to land a shot while doing it this way, but I must confess it did feel more like luck than anything else. At this point, you might well seek to inquire, if aiming is so very difficult, then why not simply use some clockwork kazooies to do the job for you? Well, quite simply, I tried and it did not work. I'm not sure if it even works when you're doing the challenge regularly. I've not bothered to try. They might have blocked it out because it makes things too easy, but when using a remote control vehicle, the clockwork kazooie launchers on the vehicle don't seem to bother shooting at any enemies nearby, whether they're Mr. Patch or other. And so going back to regular projectiles, I tried to position myself into a better position to see if being closer to Patches made it easier to judge the shots. It, of course, did, but in reality is a short-term solution. You see, even if I managed to actually shoot all of the patches on Mr. Patch that I can see, the fact of the matter is there's other ones behind him and above him that a vehicle placed on the ground would never be able to see, and so therefore from my low vantage point would make it difficult to ever really win this challenge. Which means, you guessed it, the only way to really take down Mr. Patch is to have it so that the actual remote control part of the vehicle that you sit in is also able to move around and preferably fly. The only problem with that, however, is that the same controls that control your drone are the controls that control your controller. So whenever you're trying to reposition your drone, you're also going to be turning your controller, and so your vision and vantage point is going to be constantly shifting, making the already difficult challenge of aiming even more so, and even making the whole thing somewhat dizzying. In the end, I approached this by putting no propellers or jets or means of propulsion on the controller part of the vehicle, but instead simply some balloons. What this meant is that while steering was still rather difficult because it affected both the controller and the drone, I didn't actually have to worry about power, which becomes a problem if you put a jet or something on your controller, because then while positioning your controller, it's easy to lose track of your drone. However, since instead I simply use balloons, my controller part of the vehicle is simply drifting around, meaning that my main concerns are more focused in making sure that the controller is drifting in the right direction, and I can concentrate far more on actually aiming with my drone from a closer vantage point. This method is, while still being the best I've found so far, certainly not, as you might well imagine, without its problems. Firstly, the actual controller itself obscures a lot of the vision, making even seeing where your drone is not exactly an easy task. And then secondly, there's of course the major trade-off in that your controller having only balloon power means that while you can control the drone much better, actually repositioning the controller itself is pretty difficult and very, for lack of the better word, floaty. Despite this, using this method was far more successful and higher scoring than any other I attempted. Which, I suppose, is not actually saying too much because in the end, the highest score I was able to achieve overall was forcing 5 of Mr. Patch's patches to require further patching. An end result that most people, and certainly Humble Wumble, would agree is probably not a great score and definitely not worthy of a jiggy. Speaking of end results, this episode here brings us to the end of the Nutty Acres installment of Bots and Drones. I, at some point, might return to Bots and Drones to do Logbox 720 if enough people want it, or if I just feel like doing it myself, but this will be the last Bots and Drones for at least a little while. I suppose consider it a season finale of some sorts. We're taking a break and heading into Halloween content for October, and then beginning November and continuing on into the new year, Nuts and Bolts will return for another builder's guide and a bunch more build requests. And so, since this is basically the season finale of the Nutty Acres installment of Bots and Drones, we might as well tally up the score so far. Part 1 Great Balls of Fire was suitably successful, giving us a G score. Part 2 Grunty's Loco Coco was even more successful, awarding us with a Trophy Thomas score. And then dropping back once more to a Jiggy score for Part 3, Fighting Fit, and Part 4, Save Our Statue, before unfortunately failing to get anything whatsoever for Leaky Waterworks in Part 5. Luckily, redemption was achieved in Part 6, Farmhand of the Year, giving us yet another trophy time, Part 7, Beat the Fleet, giving us a somewhat acceptable Jiggy, and then Part 8 coming home strong with yet another Trophy Thomas in Hard Boiled Egg. And of course, as you just saw, Part 9 ended on somewhat of a sour note, unfortunately failing to take down Mr. Patch, which means as it stands the scoreboard in Bots and Drones currently has us after 9 challenges awarded with 7 Jiggies, 3 of which are actually Trophy Thomas times. Now, I don't like to end on a sour note, and 3 Trophy Thomas scores is very close to 4 Trophy Thomas scores, which is yet another Jiggy, and I feel like now that I have the experience of having done the Nutty Acres leg of Bots and Drones, I can probably go back and actually get a Trophy Thomas score in one of the earlier challenges. Which somewhat brings us back to Part 4 for the reprisal of Save Our Statue. This time, however, rather than just covering it up with the largest drone I can build, I'm instead utilising the Sticky Ball drone, which has quickly become my favourite drone that I've used throughout this series. The plan is somewhat elegant in its simplicity. Pick up the statue, and then play a game of Keep Away Chasey with Gruntilda's Air Force of Clockwork Kamikaze Cretins. I have, as you can probably tell, sped up the footage of this laughable scene of lunacy, and if I did not fear that it would give me a copyright claim, I would have probably put Benny Hill music to this. It's just really funny to do, really fun to watch, and reminds me quite a lot of that scene at the beginning of Lilo and Stitch in which all of the police cars are chasing Stitch's stolen red one. Towards the very end of the challenge, my drone ran out of fuel, but luckily it was with little enough time that the enemies could not catch up and destroy the statue. And so you guessed it, the 4th Trophy Thomas score was achieved, giving us an 8th Jiggy, and I would say on any day, getting 8 Jiggies from 9 challenges when doing something as silly as the Bots and Drones challenge is not a bad score. Which brings us to the end of not just this video, but the entirety of the Nutty Acres leg of the Bots and Drones challenge. And so, as always, thanks for not only watching this, but all of the Bots and Drones videos if you did, and until next time, I have been and still am Grim Grindle, and you have been watching Bots and Drones Episode 9, Old Dog New Tricks, and Save Our Statue Reprisal.